Hello all the crazy people out there, my name is Michael, I like wizards and dragons and making games, and welcome back to my introductory series on using GameMaker. So, in the last couple of videos, we talked about the basics of getting set up with the engine. We've talked about things like code, if you've never seen code before. We've talked about things like sprites and objects and tiles and tile maps, and all the various things that you can do with those. And today, I'm going to deal with something that's been bothering me for a couple of videos now, and that is the fact that when I run the game is going to start zoomed out all the way to view basically the entirety of the room that we've been working in. And the player in this room is fairly small. And like, if you want to see any details about what the player is doing, you kind of have to like squint a little bit. And it would be nice if there was a way that we could zoom in the camera on the player and we could have like a blown up view of what's going around the player's immediate surroundings that'll be stretched to fill the entire game window. And that is the basics of using cameras. So before we start, a bit of a forewarning. If you haven't run into this already, this is something you are going to run into eventually. In games, and no less in GameMaker, there's usually a bunch of different ways that you can accomplish the same thing. And there are, of course, a bunch of different ways that you can set up views and cameras in GameMaker. And because it's the internet, and people on the internet just love arguing with each other about random stuff, you will also find people arguing loudly on the internet about why their way of handling views and cameras is the best way of handling views and cameras. By and large, that's nonsense. Different games are going to need different things from their cameras, and if we take a game like this, which is maybe something that's reminiscent of like a top-down RPG, like a Dragon Quest, or like a top-down Zelda game, like Link to the Past or something like that, the needs of an in-game camera for something like this is going to be very different from the needs of something like Super Mario. Like a 2D side-scroller. And I'm not interested today in getting into the game design philosophy of what makes a good camera, as much as I'm interested in talking about technically how you would set something like this up. So, out of the box, GameMaker comes with a system called Viewports and Cameras, which is what we're going to use today. I am actually not going to touch any code today. If you want more complicated, advanced behaviors in your camera system, you probably should do it through code. You shouldn't do what I'm going to do here today. But I think it's still useful to see how GameMaker's basic viewports and camera system works if you're just getting started before you try to dive into writing your own. And in particular, I don't actually think GameMaker's viewports and camera system is as bad as most other people seem to think it is, at least not for small games. If you're just making a small game and you just need something that works, it's perfectly fine. Meanwhile, if you're trying to make a game that with a camera that moves around and does like dynamic transitions between characters and that sort of thing, you're probably better off writing your own. Anyway, so to find the viewports and camera systems, you go into your room editor, and you look at your room inspector here on the side, and there's a tab called Viewports and Cameras, which will expand to show you a bunch of other stuff. If, by the way, you have clicked on something else like a layer or an object within a layer, and something else has come up on this section of the UI, you can get the room inspector back by just either closing the room and reopening it, or clicking on the tab at the top of the IDE that says RM_level1, and that'll bring it back and you can continue doing what you were doing. So by default, the system will be disabled, and GameMaker, when you run your game, will just have the entire room showing within the game window. And if you want to enable viewports and cameras, you can check the Enable Viewports box, and you can also check the visible box inside one or more of these different viewports. So GameMaker, by default, will give you up to 8 viewports. They're indexed 0 through 7 because there are 2 hard problems in computer science. One is asynchronous netcode, another is p equals np, and the last is off by 1 errors. I'm mostly just going to talk about viewport index 0 here. If you want to have like split screen multiplayer, you might use the other viewports, but again, for something like that, if you go that far, you probably might want to consider writing your own from the various view handling functions in code and not using this. Anyway, I'm going to go check the visible box by viewport index 0, and when we do that, we can see that a white rectangle has appeared around the room. And this white rectangle is going to indicate the part of the room which is visible to the camera. So what I think I want to do here is I want to just have a rectangle that's focused on the player, something like maybe this entire room is 1366 by 768, which is currently the default GameMaker room size. Let's say that I wanted to have a rectangle around the player that's 640 by 360, and that just follows the player around within the room. I could set the width and the height of viewport camera index 0 to, what did I say, 640 by 360, something like that. And now The rectangle is going to change size. We can see that it is now going to occupy this upper left corner of the room. And if I run the game, we are going to see that this corner of the room has been blown up, and it is going to fill the entire game window. It is not, however, following the player around, and if I were to have the player walk off screen, he's just going to disappear off screen, and the viewport isn't going to move with him. So we'll put that on our list of things that probably should be addressed in this video. The X position and Y position of the viewport. So this is probably less useful most of the time. So in this room, you can see that this rectangle is in the upper left corner of the room. Its upper left corner is at coordinate 0, 0. And you can move it around. Let's say if you wanted to move the rectangle to like 400 and 200 or something like that. You can move the rectangle around, and now when I run the game, we'll see that it's going to be focused on like the middle of the room. And we've got our player here, and we can still go running around, running off the screen. And it's still not going to follow us. I don't think the X position and Y position, at least setting it in the room editor like this, is useful that often. I think most of the time, if you're going to do something like this, you probably want the view to follow the player, and you don't want it to occupy a fixed coordinate in the room. It is possible, of course, that you might want a view to occupy a fixed coordinate in the room, and if you do want something like that, you could define the position like this. But if we want the view to follow the player around, let's go down here to view following, skipping over viewport properties because that's something I'm going to come back to later. We can click the no object, and we can assign the obj_player as our object following for this viewport. And now if I run the game, we can see that if I get close to the bottom of the screen, the view is going to move with us. If I get close to the side of the screen, the view is going to move with us. If I get close to the other side of the screen, we're going to have to walk all the way back, and the view is going to follow. It will not follow us out of the room. So if I get all the way up to a room boundary, then we're just going to leave the view, and the view isn't going to leave the room. It is possible for stuff to exist outside of rooms in GameMaker, but GameMaker's default system of views won't ever like move outside a room. Anyway, I think the fact that we have to get like all the way up close to the edge of the room before it'll to the edge of the view before it will start moving is a little bit weird. It feels more than anything like we're just pushing the view around, especially when we get to the top of the screen and like it looks like we are just shoving the window with our helmet. And if you don't want the player to have to get all the way up to the side of the room before the view starts to move, the side of the view before the view starts to move, you can set the horizontal and the vertical border properties to change this. So if I set the horizontal border to something like 160, this is going to define the distance to the side of the view that the player will have to get to before it'll start moving. If I run the game now, we'll see that now I'm going to be much farther away from the side of the view before it starts moving. The top and bottom of the screen are still the same as it was before because I haven't changed the vertical border. I still feel like it feels like the player is pushing the view around rather than the camera is following the player. So I think what I'll do instead is I will set the horizontal border to half of the view width, so that'll be half of 640, which is 320, and I'll set the vertical border to half the view height, which is going to be 180, and this is going to effectively cause the player to be centered inside the view. The camera will automatically snap to the player's position at the center. The border, if you can even call it a border at this point, is going to be like half the entire window. So, if the player gets anywhere that isn't like the center of the screen, basically the view will follow. The exceptions, of course, being the top and bottom of the screen, the edges of the room. If you run out of the room, the camera will obviously stop. So, right now, the camera will automatically snap to the player's position. It is possible to give the camera a bit of lag, a bit of inertia, so that it lags behind the player. So I'm moving. I've set the player to move at about 4 pixels per step, or exactly 4 pixels per step rather. And if you want to define a maximum speed that the camera will follow the player with, or follow whatever other player with, you can set the horizontal and vertical speed down here in the viewport settings. So -1, a negative number is going to indicate that the camera will effectively move infinitely fast, and it will just snap to the player's position whenever they move. If you set the speed to something instead like 3, we're going to see that the camera, when I move... Did I accidentally change something? Did my keyboard bug out? The player kept moving down. Is my keyboard working? Hello? My keyboard stopped working. Alright. I don't know what happened there. I unplugged it and plugged it back in. I hope nothing's happening to this keyboard because don't really want to have to replace any electronics right now. So if I move up and down, we can see that the viewport just snaps to our position immediately because I haven't changed that. If I move left and right, we can see that it lags somewhat behind the player, and when I stop moving, it's going to take a moment to catch up with us, like this. And if you do want it to feel like the camera has a bit of inertia, you can make use of the horizontal speed and the vertical speed and that sort of thing. I don't really want that from this camera. There's a couple of other situations I can think of where you might want something like that, such as like if the player teleports to a new location and you want the camera to scroll, or if the camera snaps to a new object. You set the object following to something else and you want the camera to scroll. You might want that behavior. But I think most of the time when you're just moving around, having the camera lag like that will be a little bit disorienting. So now we've hit the important parts. Let's talk about the viewport properties. So the viewport properties differs from the camera properties in that the camera properties is what you can think of as like the bounds around the player, which the camera will be focused on, whereas the viewport properties is going to pertain to the region on screen outside of the game world. By default, the viewport is going to have the height and width of the game window, and the game window is going to have the height and width by default of just the room that you create. And if you wanted to set the width and height of the viewport to, for example, let's go with old reliable 360 by 640 by 360. If I run the game now, we can see that we've now got that same rectangle on the screen that's following the player around, but our game window is going to be much smaller than it was before. This is 640 by 360 window on the screen, and it's not going to be like zoomed in or anything like that. So if I set this back to, actually before I do that, before I reset it, we can also talk about the X position and Y position of the viewport. So if this is only really going to be important if you have multiple views. I mentioned that it's possible to do things like setting the sides of the game window through code, and it's also possible to have multiple views, which are going to be focused on different parts of the room or different characters or something like that. And I'm not going to get too into this because it does get complicated and messy pretty quickly, and I don't want to... I'd rather focus on the stuff that I think people are actually going to be making use of. But if I set the X position and Y position of the viewport to 100, 100, and if I run the game, we're going to see that now instead of the viewport camera being like originating in the corner of the game window, it's going to be offset by a little bit. And if you really wanted to, for whatever reason, you could have a viewport that follows the player, and you could have it occupy only a particular region on screen. And if you had like two-player split screen or something like that, you could have two viewports, and one would occupy like the left half of the screen, and the other would occupy the right half of the screen. I'm not going to go into that today. I don't have anything against like couch co-op or anything like that, but again, if you want to do something that's a little bit more advanced like that, you should probably think about using code for this instead of using GameMaker's built-in viewports. So we're going to be putting that back to the way it was, and I think I'm going to say return the game window to its original size, and that is going to allow us to run around freely in a full-size game window. Maybe not full-sized, a larger game window, and zoomed in a little bit around the player. Alright, so that's all there really is for GameMaker viewports and cameras as you can define in the room editor. Again, if you do want more, you will want to look at code, and you can see that there is quite a few functions which relate to views and cameras, which you can access through code. I'll probably make a video on this later. If you don't want to wait for that, the Pixelated Pope has a much more in-depth series of videos on views and cameras in GameMaker that you might be interested in watching. So I'll have links to those down in the description and stuff. But I think I'm gonna end this off here. So my name is Michael. I like Wizards and Dragons and making games. You should all go check out Wizarducks and the Lost Hat, which is one of the games that I like to work on when I'm not doing YouTube stuff. Link to the Steam page to that can be found down below. I have a Patreon, so if you want to contribute to the channel, links to that can be found down there as well. I hope you all found that useful, and I will see you all later. Special thanks to Zenjamin, Zach Robinson, Squarecrow, Spideye Games, Pixelated Pope, Paradox, Manta Ray, GameMaker, Gamer Indie, Edward Holt, DJ Gibbles, Brenton, Bokeh Dev, and Arger the Naut for supporting these videos. If you would like to join these wonderful people, head on over to the Patreon page down in the video description to join the fun.